Thanks, Anna, and good morning, everyone. And thanks for coming on this wisdom detour to 1 Corinthians with me this morning. Well, I want to take you back to 2007, the year of Kevin '07. And looking out, I'm getting that some people might not even remember that phrase. This is the year that Kevin Rudd, with Julia Gillard by his side, went to the Australian people as a united team for the Australian Labor Party, asking them to vote him in as Prime Minister of Australia, which the public did. They won this landslide victory back in '07. And, well, it wasn't long before reports emerged that there was trouble within the party after they'd had this victory. And then this anti-Rudd camp emerged, complaining that Rudd was authoritarian and narcissistic. And then a pro-Rudd camp emerged, complaining that the anti-Rudd camp, the faceless men, were white-anting their leader. If you think that church has suddenly got really political, I am going somewhere with this, so So observers from the outside reported that what they were seeing was increasing conflict, increasing dysfunction, and it reached a climax in 2010. So for months, Gillard had said she wasn't planning to overthrow Rudd, yet there was a late-night meeting when her supporters told her she had the numbers, and so she walked into Rudd's office and told him, this one that she had previously stood united with, that she was going to challenge him for his role. And she won. She became the Prime Minister. But the battle wasn't over. Rudd apparently still held ambitions to return to the leadership, and so the pro-Gillard camp started accusing Rudd of leaking information, undermining her. Meanwhile, the pro-Rudd camp depicted him as the victim of a brutal coup and as someone who deserved another go. And by 2013, some of you might remember, it was all on again. And there was another leadership spill, another Prime Minister was deposed, and the one who had been the ouster, the one who was ousted, in 2010 now became the ouster in 2013. Rudd was PM again. That's not the full story. The full story is one with many players, and it's filled, if you read it in detail, it's filled with ambition and gossip and betrayal and backstabbing and factions and power grabs. Now, maybe as you're listening to me recount this story, if you're a Liberal voter, you might be thinking, typical Labor, that's the problem is the Labor Party. But I could just as easily have told that story, stories of ambition and betrayal from what happened next with the Liberal Party, with the coups of Abbott and Turnbull and Morrison years that followed. In fact, you could read all about it in this book, Vendettas, Betrayals and the Price of Power, a book which advertises itself as a cracking account of the rivalries and hatreds that split the Liberal Party. So then maybe you're tempted to say, okay, the problem here is politics. The problem is politicians. But no, we can't get out of it that easily either. In fact, you'll find the same issues in the business world. You'll find the same issues in the arts world. You'll find the same issues in the sports world. You'll find the same issues, and we've just prayed about it, in the world of geopolitics and international relations. You probably found the same issues if you're a worker in your workplace. Ambition, gossip, betrayal, backstabbing, factions, power grabs, conflict. You go into any ordinary workplace in Australia, you'll probably find these things. In fact, you can read all about them in this book, Office Politics, How to Thrive in a World of Lying, Backstabbing and Dirty Tricks. Now that's a book worth reading, isn't it? Ambition, power grabs, factions, gossip, betrayal, conflict. These things happen whenever humans get together. And if we're honest with ourselves, if I'm honest with myself, we know that there's the potential for these things to happen in all of our relationships. Our relationships at work, with our friends, with our families, even here at church. How do we escape this? Well, when Paul wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians to the church in Corinth, he was writing to a church that was drowning in exactly these kind of problems. There was boasting, there was gossip, there was factions, there was division, there was conflict. They had it all at Corinth. But his diagnosis of the problem I think is really interesting, and it's especially interesting for us as a church this term. Because it seems to me when he was confronting all of these problems in Corinth, there's a whole lot of different ways he could have addressed it, a whole lot of different ways he could have gone. But he actually says to them, the problem is a wisdom problem. Your problem is a wisdom problem, Corinthian church, which is tearing yourselves apart. So, of course, we're on this wisdom journey here at City Light this term. We're learning wisdom, apart from this week, from the book of Proverbs. As Jacob said, Jeremy 6, so unfortunately the next Proverbs talk will have to be put back to next week. But in this unexpected spare slot, what Jacob and I decided to do last night was take this excursus to the New Testament, one of the most famous New Testament texts about wisdom, and to ask what we can learn here. Because when Paul's addressing these problems of conflict and factionalism and fighting and human nature, he doesn't just say this is a wisdom problem, he also provides them with a wisdom solution for that. And if you're with me on agreeing that we have the potential for these problems in our heart and our relationships, then we also need that wisdom solution. So what we're going to do this morning is we'll dive into 1 Corinthians 2 and to ask what can we learn about wisdom here which can come along with us and add to us what we're learning about wisdom from Proverbs as we continue to go through the term. So if you've got a Bible, keep it open to 1 Corinthians 2 or a phone. The texts should come up here as well. I'll very briefly summarise what's happened in the first chapter of the letter so we can make sense of chapter 2. So like I said before, huge problem with lots of infighting in the church. And what they're doing is they're dividing into factions over which of their Christian leaders is their favourite. I follow Paul, say some. I follow Apollos, say others. I follow Cephas, say a third group. And Paul says to them, what you're doing here is you're living according to the wisdom of the world. See, the world values things like impressiveness and clever speech and status. And the Corinthians are living by those values, and then they're looking at their Christian preachers and saying, well, I think that one's the best one. And someone else says, no, I think that one's the best one. And they end up having fights and breaking into these little groups over that, these factions and conflicts, just like the Labour Party, just like the Liberal Party, just like all human beings. And Paul says, no, that's the wisdom of the world. And what he does in this section of the letter, he says, I want to call you out of that way of thinking and living and acting, the wisdom of the world, and I want you to live by the wisdom of God, something completely different. Now, to do that, I've been thinking about this overnight. To do that, he could have said, let's go to the book of Proverbs and learn about conflict, because there's lots of good stuff in the book of Proverbs on conflict. Or he could have gone and said, let's look about what the Proverbs warns about chasing after power or status. He could have done all of that. But he doesn't. That would have been good, but it's not what he does. What he does is he talks about what we could call a development in God's revealing of his wisdom to us. A development since the time that the book of Proverbs was written and compiled. And this development is Jesus. God has sent Jesus to save humanity through death on the cross. And Paul says in chapter 1 that this is an expression of God's wisdom, perhaps the ultimate expression of God's wisdom. Have a look, if you've got a Bible there, to chapter 1, verse 22 of 1 Corinthians. He says, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom. So both of these groups have something that they value. Jews, miraculous signs. Greeks, the wisdom of the world. Impressiveness, status, and those kinds of things. But we, says Paul, we preach Christ crucified. A stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. This message of Christ crucified is actually the wisdom of God. Christ crucified. When Christ dies on the cross, that is God revealing his wisdom in a new and a special and an ultimate and an incredible way. If we want to learn wisdom, we need to understand this. Now, last week, we saw in Proverbs 8 that God reveals his wisdom in creation. He builds his wisdom into creation. And that that's true, and that remains true in this new covenant age. If we want to thrive in this world, we need to live in light of God's created design, the way he's built wisdom into the world. So that's wisdom in creation. But we're learning something new here. He also reveals his wisdom in salvation, in Jesus dying on the cross. And so as new covenant people who live now after the coming of Christ, if we want to live wisely, we don't just need to learn that Proverbs wisdom of wisdom in creation. We also need to learn, what is it about wisdom that's revealed in salvation, in the cross? And that's what our task is for today. That's what 1 Corinthians 2 is going to tell us. This salvation wisdom, this way of the cross wisdom. How do we get it? What does it do in our lives? That's what chapter 2 is going to tell us. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to highlight 3 things that Paul says about this kind of wisdom, which I'm calling the way of the cross wisdom. Okay, first one. It seems unimpressive from a worldly perspective, this way of the cross wisdom. I'll read from chapter 2, verse 1. And so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you, so Paul's talking about when he came to the Corinthians, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness, with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words. So when Paul visited the Corinthians, he preached the gospel message to them, the message of God's true wisdom to them, and he's saying it probably didn't sound that impressive to you by human standards. So to put that in a contemporary, well, almost contemporary, ABC's Q&A, I don't think that show exists anymore, but if he was on ABC's Q&A, he probably didn't win the debate. He probably didn't sound that impressive. But, he says, that doesn't mean what I spoke wasn't true wisdom. It was. Verse 6, he says, we do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. Just because it didn't sound impressive according to the standards of the world's wisdom doesn't mean it wasn't wisdom. It was. It was the true way of the cross wisdom of God, which means we've got an issue here. We've got a problem here. The problem is recognizing true wisdom, recognizing God's wisdom. If we have been conditioned by the world to understand what wisdom is, we may not recognize it. There's a chance we'll miss it. We might hear the wisdom of God and miss it completely, because the wisdom of God is so different to the wisdom of the world, what people of the world consider to be wise and impressive. And he goes on to say that people do miss it. Verse 8, none of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. The rulers of this age, they don't understand true wisdom. Paul thinks of the world in terms of 2 ages. The present age, which is characterized by ungodliness and human sin and rebellion. And then there's this age to come, the age of the Messiah, where his rule will be unopposed in all the world. And what Paul sees is that with Jesus, that age to come is already breaking into this world. And so Jesus has brought that new type of wisdom into this world, true wisdom, way of the cross wisdom. But while we still live in this age, and the rulers of this age are still in charge, as far as we can see, they don't get it. They don't understand it. They don't get that wisdom. And then there's a danger that we, Christians, Christ's people, will also miss it. In fact, that's exactly what's going on in the church in Corinth. They're Christians, but they're missing Christ's wisdom. They're living according to the wisdom of this age. They're missing out on what true wisdom is, and that's what Paul is trying to help them to see. And it's folly. It's folly when we miss out on this true wisdom. Because it says at the end of verse 6 that the rulers of this age, they're coming to nothing. They've got this empire which is doomed. And if we live according to their wisdom and according to their system, seems impressive, sure. It seems like the way of power and strength. It's coming to nothing, says Paul. It's folly to live that way. Which makes it really tragic when you and I get shaped by the wisdom of the world, and let our lives be shaped by that. When we value the things that the Corinthians were allowing the world to teach them to value, like status, impressiveness, power, and then using the means of the world to achieve those, like gossip and slander and divisions and factions. It's tragic because it's all coming to nothing. It's the way of folly. It's where all folly leads. It's a death and destruction. So that's the first thing we've learnt about this true way of the cross wisdom. It seems unimpressive from a worldly perspective, meaning we might well miss it if we fail to recognise it. So how do we recognise it then? Well, Paul goes on to talk more about that. The second point is this. This way of the cross wisdom is something that we can grasp only with the help of God's Spirit. I'll read from verse 9. However, as it is written, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no human mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him, these are the things God has revealed to us by his Spirit. So this kind of wisdom, this way of the cross wisdom, the fact that God would save the world through the death of his Son on the cross, it was previously not yet revealed. No eye had seen it, no ear had heard it. And frankly, no human could ever have come up with it. It says no mind had conceived. No one thought that up. We couldn't come up with it ourselves. It wasn't something we could grasp. It wasn't something we could understand. It wasn't something we could work out or create by ourselves with our own ingenuity. How could we get it then? How could we access this wisdom? Well, only by God revealing it to us. Verse 10, these are the things God has revealed to us by his Spirit. So in some sense, the cross was a public, objective thing that anyone could see or hear witness testimony about. So in that sense, God revealed his wisdom publicly to the whole world, for the whole world to see. Problem is, because we're also infected by human wisdom and human ways of seeing things, when that act of God's ultimate act of revealing his wisdom happened, people couldn't see it for what it was. A man suffering on a cross? That's not a demonstration of power. That's not a compelling argument. How could that be the ultimate in wisdom? And so if any of us are ever going to grasp this true revelation of God's wisdom, we don't just need that public objective event or hearing about it, but we also need this private work of God in our heart and our mind. That is the work of the Holy Spirit, convicting us of the truth of that and convicting us that that is the wisdom of God. Are you someone who believes that God has saved you through the death of his Son Jesus on the cross? Because if you are, then you're someone in whom this act of revelation has already happened. God's Spirit has come to you, and it's only by God's Spirit that you could believe that. God has revealed his true wisdom to you. Praise God, you have that. That's something you've got by God's Spirit. And Paul unpacks this a bit more in continuing in verse 10. I'll read from the second half of verse 10. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. That is, the Spirit seeks out, it knows the purposes and plans and thoughts of God. And then I'll keep reading from verse 11. For who knows a person's thoughts except their own spirit within them? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. See, no one, he's just making this argument here, no one knows someone else's inner thoughts except that person's own spirit. See, like, no matter how well you get to know me, you can't really know what's going on inside my head the way my own spirit within me knows, because it's all going on in there. And it's just sort of an argument he's making. Same with God. We can't know the purposes of God, the plans of God, the wisdom of God, like the Spirit of God can, unless the Spirit of God reveals that, what's going on inside God's mind, reveals that to us. And he's saying that's what's happened here. Verse 12. what we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. Wow. We've been given the Spirit of God, the mind of God. And by that we can understand God's wisdom, this message of the cross, the ultimate God's way of the cross wisdom. See, without God's Spirit, when you hear the story of a man dying on a cross, you'll react to it the way people have throughout the ages who are not believers. They'll say, that's a barbaric story. How awful, stop telling that story. Or that's a foolish story. Or that's an idiotic story. Or that's a weak story, someone dying on a cross. But with the Spirit, we see, no, that is the most precious, most wonderful, most wise thing that's ever happened in the history of the human race, the history of the world. God sending his Son to die in our place. Anna and I and our family, we were missionaries in Indonesia for many years. I remember way back to the start of our time there, we were at language school. And each week we used to go along to church, and then we'd come out at the end of church telling each other how much of the sermon we'd understood in this language we were still just learning. At first it was, I got about 5% of that, 10%. And whatever I had, you could sort of triple it or quadruple it for Anna, and that's how much she understood. And I remember that by the time we were getting to about me at 40%, her at 90%, we decided to go to a different church one week. And we went along to this different church. And neither of us could understand a single word. It was so depressing. We thought, I've been working so hard. We're 6 months into language school. What's going on? And we had our pocket translator out. This was before smartphones and Google Translate. We couldn't make any sense of it. It just made no sense to it. And eventually we realized, this is an ethnic minority church. They're speaking in a completely different language. No wonder we couldn't understand that. See, without knowing that other language, everything that we heard that day was going to remain completely incomprehensible to us. And what Paul's saying here is, without the Spirit of God, the message of the cross will always remain completely incomprehensible. But with the Spirit that you have as a believer, if you're a believer, with the Spirit, we're able to recognize that the cross is the true wisdom of God. And so we're able to shape our lives according to it. Isn't that good news? So that's our first 2 points. This way of the cross wisdom, first, it seems unimpressive from the worldly perspective. Second, it's something that we can grasp only by God's Spirit. Now, if that's the case, let's just think about a few implications. We don't need to feel insecure if the really smart or really powerful people around us don't believe in the message of the cross. And at the same time, if we do believe it, we shouldn't boast about that. It's kind of what the Corinthians were doing, boasting about their spiritual prowess. We shouldn't boast about it. This access to this wisdom of God, it's a gift, isn't it? The gift of the Spirit. It's not our own cleverness that's discovered it. Okay, let's move on to where the rubber hits the road. The third point about this way of the cross wisdom is that it shapes our words and thoughts and lives. This true wisdom, once we have it, once it's revealed by the Spirit to us, it changes us, it transforms us, transforming what we say, what we think, what we do, to make it all cross-shaped. Let's start with speech. When Paul speaks, what's actually going on there? Verse 13, I'll read from verse 13. This is what we speak, not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, explaining spiritual realities with Spirit-taught words. This is what happens when a person with the Spirit speaks. God's true wisdom is what they speak. This way of the cross wisdom is what comes out. It shapes what Paul says he's saying. So Paul's words are now cross-shaped in the sense that they're shaped by this reality-changing truth this ultimate expression of God's wisdom was Jesus dying for us. That shapes everything Paul says. Which means as one now with God's wisdom, he's able to speak these taught by the Spirit words. He's able to explain spiritual realities, he says. So that's speech, but it's not just speech that this wisdom shapes in Paul and in us. It shapes our thoughts. It shapes our lives. Have a look at verses 14 and 15 with me. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. So going back to not having the Spirit, you can't discern the true wisdom of God without the Spirit. You can't have those cross-shaped thoughts. But the person with the Spirit, verse 15, can. Keep reading in verse 15. The person with the Spirit makes judgments about all things. These judgments, these thoughts, this ability to discern true wisdom from false wisdom. The person with the Spirit has this God-shaped lens, God wisdom-shaped lens, this way of the cross-shaped lens for viewing reality, for understanding life, for understanding true wisdom. It's the lens that they now view the world through. With the person with the Spirit, they now have Christ and what Christ did on the cross kind of at the center of their life. This way of the cross is now, it's like a test for whether something is wise or whether something is foolish. How they assess life, make decisions in life. And then Paul sums up with this remarkable conclusion where he's saying what's going on here is that we're thinking and acting with the mind of God, which really is remarkable. He says, verse 16, "For who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him?" Now what's interesting here is he's actually quoting from the Old Testament where the rhetorical question is, who's known the mind of God? And the implied answer is, no one can know the mind of God. And then he flips it and he says, verse 16, end of verse 16, "But we have the mind of Christ." So it used to be the case that, who knows the mind of God? But now it's we, with the Spirit, we have the mind of Christ. We have God's ultimate wisdom revealed to us by his Spirit. So now we're able to view the world through this cross-shaped wisdom lens. We can speak cross-shaped words. We can live cross-shaped lives. Because we know that despite everything that the world's going to tell us, that is the path to true wisdom. Okay, so that's what we've learnt from that text, and let's summarise now. Let's try to bring it all together and think about what it means for our pursuit of wisdom. So what we've seen this morning is that with the coming of Christ, there's like this new development in wisdom. Everything that we have learned from Proverbs and everything that we will be learning from Proverbs in the coming weeks remains true and crucially important. That wisdom that's built into creation that teaches us how to thrive in this world, that's true and vitally important. But what we've seen in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2 today is that with the coming of Christ, God reveals his wisdom in a surprising way. The death of his own Son is the means by which he saves the world. And that revelation of God's wisdom is so upside down that the world doesn't get it. The people of the world miss it. They don't grasp it. We don't grasp it. No one can grasp it unless God reveals it to us by his Spirit. But when he does reveal it to us by his Spirit and we do grasp that truth, it becomes the lens through which we see our lives, through which we become wise. It shapes our goals, it shapes our decisions, it shapes our thoughts, it shapes our dreams for our lives. And so I've been thinking, we're in Proverbs, and then I'm reading 1 Corinthians 2 last night, ever since Jacob called me. How does this all fit together? Proverbs and 1 Corinthians 2. And this is what I'm thinking. Perhaps we can explore this through the course of this series. The Proverbs-style wisdom that we're learning in Proverbs, that's going to teach us how to be wise with our money. How not to waste our money like a fool so that we might well become wealthy. Remember last week we saw in Proverbs 8 that one of the fruits of wisdom is wealth and prosperity. So Proverbs wisdom might well teach us that, which is wonderful. And then cross-shaped wisdom is going to tell us what to do with that wealth. If my thoughts and words and life are cross-shaped, I'm going to use my wealth to advance the spread of the gospel. Or another example, Proverbs will teach us how to have, if we're married, how to have a good marriage. That was the topic we would have had this morning, and I presume that's what we'll have next week. Proverbs teaches us how to have a good marriage. Cross-shaped wisdom tells us what to do with that good, healthy marriage. That is, devote it to advancing the gospel and being a display of a good marriage that brings glory to Christ. Or Proverbs, again, has a lot to say about how we use our words, what kind of words we say, the bad ways of using words, good ways of using words. A cross-shaped wisdom is going to tell me what to do with that gift of speech, to build people up, to tell others the gospel, and so on. See, if this ultimate revelation of wisdom is the wisdom of the cross then becomes the lens through which we see our lives, through which we make our decisions in life. The cross is the thing which will help us to live really wise lives. A really wise person is the person who centers their life around the cross. So I just want to finish with one story. There's many I could tell, including many of stories of people in this church, but this is a story of a couple that I've known for many years who I think live out this reality really well. The names are Bob and Jenny. They were mentors to me in my very first year as an 18-year-old living away from home. I was living down in Canberra at uni. And they invited me along to their Bible study group, and I got to see their lives and in many ways got to see what a cross-shaped life might look like as I got to know them. So these were people who were very bright and had achieved very high university qualifications and could have probably pursued all sorts of careers, but they'd deliberately chosen to get not particularly ambitious jobs at the university because they wanted to devote themselves to doing mentoring to people like me, university student evangelism and discipleship. They could have got the money they got from their jobs and put them into a house that would be the best investment or that would be the best size for their family, but what they chose was to buy a house that was literally across the road from the university so that they could live this cross-shaped life, pouring their life into discipling people and sharing the good news. And that house was there for Bible studies and events. That is a life that many using wisdom of the world would say, that's folly. That's not the best use of your money. That's not the best use of your career potential. That's folly. But I think after we look at what we've seen in 1 Corinthians 2, see, that's true wisdom lived out, a cross-shaped life. As Paul said in chapter 1, Christ crucified, it was a stumbling block to the Jews. It was foolishness to the Greeks. And let's be honest, it's foolishness to most Australians still today. But actually, it's God's expression of his true wisdom. And the more we understand that, the more we get that, the more we're going to realize that the very best, the very wisest life we could ever live is that cross-shaped life. Cross-shaped life. Just as Jesus sacrificed himself on the cross, we'll be sacrificing ourselves for the sake of advancing that same message. Let's pray together.